Matthew chapter 2 this morning. We find one of the actual most peculiar stories in the Bible, which also happens to be one of the most familiar stories because it's part of the great Advent narrative that we find in the Bible. And it tells of an event that took place sometime after Jesus was born in the town of Bethlehem, when some foreigners come into town. They're called magi. And they show up in Jerusalem, and they're completely unannounced. And they really throw the entire city up for a loop, really. And traditionally, these guys, these magi, have been known as the Three Kings of Orient, right? You know that song? We Three Kings. Which is interesting because the Bible never tells us how many there are. We don't know if there were 2 or 3 or 8. We don't know. It never labels them as royalty. In fact, they probably were not kings or royal individuals, and it never says that they're from the Orient. So don't believe everything that you hear in Christmas carols. Okay, there was probably no drummer boy at the manger. Anyway, besides all that, these are magi, and another word that many of your translations probably say is wise men. These were wise men. They were would have likely been astrologers from the east of Palestine or Israel would have been Babylon or perhaps Persia or even Arabia. And so these are men who studied the stars. They studied all sorts of wisdom, and they sought after truth, and they were familiar with the wisdom of the ancients. They may have also even been familiar with much of the Jewish scriptures and the writings and the history of the Jews themselves. So they were informed when they saw this star rise up in the sky at some point, in interpreting the sign that was basically Jesus's birth announcement. And so these men, just picture this for a minute, these men are pagans. They're not people of Israel. They don't know probably the God of Israel, and yet they were searchers for truth. They were looking for truth in any place they can find it, and God graciously reveals truth to them. God shows them light in the darkness, and the light that they see in the sky points to the light of the world. So here they are, these men searching for truth in the darkness, and God graciously gives it to them. And so as a result of that, they travel all this way, make this long journey to the city of David, to Jerusalem, looking for a child king in the king's city. So they come looking for a new prince. Most likely they're going to go to the royal household, which would have been the household of Herod the Great. But they don't find a prince. In fact, nobody knows what they're talking about in Jerusalem. Instead, what they do is they stir up trouble. So if you look at Matthew 2, verse 3, it says, when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Herod the king. This is Herod the Great. And he was a man who ruled over Judea for nearly 4 decades. Ethnically, he was not Jewish. He was actually Idumean and Arab. And so he wasn't Jewish, but his family at some point had converted to Judaism. And so in a sense, he kind of grew up Jewish. And he was part of a powerful family. So around 40 BC, Herod was proclaimed the king of Judea by the Roman Senate. So he had authority over all of Judea, and he basically acted as a vassal for Rome. So he's kind of like a puppet king. He really represented the interests of the emperor and of Rome, not mainly of the Jewish people. And really, if you read about Herod, the interests that he was really vying for were his own. He was really all about his own interests. He was known for being a paranoid tyrant. He spent a lot of his reign, much of his reign, consolidating and solidifying and protecting his throne from any threats, whether they were real threats or potential threats or just imagined threats. And Matthew draws attention to who Herod was here in verses 1 and 3. It says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem. And then in verse 3 again, it says, when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled. So here we have in verse 1, Herod the king. Verse 3, Herod the king. And these references to Herod act to bookend the Magi's very important question, which we find in verse 2. Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? So just picture, you've got this juxtaposition of the title king referring to Herod, and then in the middle of that referring to this rival king who's now potentially in play. So you can imagine if there's a guy who's so intent on keeping his power and a rival king rises up, that it would be troubling. Again, Herod was so famously paranoid about competition that he actually had his favorite wife and 2 of his own sons murdered, executed, because he was trying to protect his throne. And if these Magi were correct, if they truly had seen a star when it rose and they had come to worship this new king, then there must be a challenger to his throne. But the verse also says in verse 3 there that not only was Herod troubled, but all of Jerusalem with him was troubled. And wouldn't it be troubling if somebody came into town, these mysterious, kind of eccentric, foreign, they weren't Jewish, they were purveyors of occult practices and magic, and they would just show up unannounced and dramatically announce a royal birth before the royal family was even aware that anybody was pregnant. Right? It would be troubling. And so Herod is intent to flush out this potential threat, and he quickly makes use of the religious leadership to nail down the anticipated birthplace of the Messiah. So he's smart enough to know that this Messiah is a possibility. To his credit, he's aware of the prophetic witness to this. He's aware of the Old Testament. He's aware of the cultural expectations around him that a Messiah was to come. And these expectations really ran like a constant current throughout the culture of this oppressed Jewish people who were waiting for a king to come and deliver them. But these currents of Messiah also ran through his paranoid mind as a potential threat. And so we read this in verse 4. He assembled, it says, all the chief priests. These would have been Sadducees. They were the people in power, the priestly class. They had political clout and power. And then the scribes. And the scribes would have been experts in the law of Moses. And most of the scribes would have been Pharisees. So you got 2 groups, Sadducees and Pharisees. They don't often get along. But he goes to both of them anyway, assembles them, and these chief priests and scribes of the people. And it says he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. And they told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written in the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. And so these religious experts give this unanimous explanation. They're unanimously informed about the prophetic messianic hopes. So without hesitation, they identified the Messiah's birthplace in Bethlehem, which was a small village that was located about 6 miles outside of Jerusalem, a couple hours walk. And yet they're quicker. Remember, these are the religious leaders, the religious elite. They're quicker to identify the Messiah's birthplace. And with chapter and verse, they're quicker to identify his birthplace than they are to register any interest in his actual birth. Their knowledge sadly outweighed their curiosity and their devotion. It's like they knew all the answers, but they didn't care if the answers were true or not. They were accurate, they just weren't expectant. And so they missed out when the Messiah actually showed up. So they've identified now the place of Messiah's birth, and Herod then surreptitiously meets with the Magi for 2 reasons. First of all, he wants to find out how old this child potentially is. And then he wants to trick them into basically hunting him down, being his private eyes, finding the child, so that he can summarily just end the threat. So look at verse 7. It says, Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared, and he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word that I may come and worship him too. And we find out that Herod's true intention is never worship, it's protection, self-protection, which becomes clearer in verse 16, which we'll look at in a few minutes. And one thing I want to point out is that Jesus' birth is announced to a select few, unexpected people, like a poor Jewish carpenter living in Galilee and his virgin maiden bride, who's probably a teenager. Second, it's announced to a group of eccentric Gentiles. But all of the important people in the story, like Herod the Great, the chief priests and the scribes of the people, the religious authorities, the religious elite, these important people don't even appear interested enough to take trouble to venture 6 miles to Bethlehem to see for themselves if this is even true. So often, friends, I think sometimes we can find ourselves in that latter group of people, thinking ourselves important and yet not giving Jesus the time of day. So the Gentiles are the only ones, these magi are the only ones who make the modest trip 6 miles to Bethlehem to search out and pay homage to this new king. And then, interestingly enough, they're encouraged in this final leg of their journey from the very same source that drew them into the search at the first place. So look at verse 9. After listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And here's where joy finally enters into this story, into the picture. At the reappearance, most likely, so I take this to mean that the way it's written is that they had seen the star originally, which set them on their journey, and they hadn't seen it since then. And you can understand that when something gets you moving, but then it disappears for a while. You ever go fishing? You know, you get a big one on the line, and it kind of comes up, and it excites you, and then it disappears for a long time. And then it breaks the water again. You're like, oh, yeah, I can get back into this fight. You understand what's going on here. So maybe for 2 years they hadn't seen this star. They traveled all the way there, and then all of a sudden they make their way to these last 6 miles, and the star appears again. And it says, when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And Matthew's just trying to use as many words as he can here to express how excited these guys were about it. One commentator expressed the sense of his words by saying, deliriously happy may have been an overstatement, but it was something like that. They were deliriously happy. I mean, you could just see these guys maybe jumping up and down and spinning and dancing and giving high five to each other as they make their way to Bethlehem. And I don't want us to miss the prophetic importance of this. These Gentiles are coming to find this baby that was basically spotlighted for them by God himself. In Isaiah chapter 42, we read this, I am the Lord. I've called you in righteousness. I will take you by the hand and keep you. I will give you as a covenant for the people, a light for the nations, to open the eyes that are blind, to bring out the prisoners from the dungeon, from the prison those who sit in darkness. And Isaiah is referring to the Messiah here, God speaking to the Messiah, who is going to be a light for the nations, a light for the Gentiles, not just for the Jews. Isaiah 49, I will make you as a light for the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth. Isaiah chapter 60, arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord is risen upon you. For behold, darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples. But the Lord will arise upon you, and his glory will be seen upon you. And nations shall come to your light, and the kings to the brightness of your rising. They shall bring gold and frankincense, and shall bring good news, the praises of the Lord. And by the way, those verses are the reasons that some people think the Magi were actually kings when they likely weren't. But the point here is that all nations shall come to the light of the Messiah, and here we have it happening for the first time. Magi, Gentiles, who God revealed this to them, and here they come. And as the angels declare in Luke's gospel, "Fear not, for behold, I bring you good news of great joy that will be for just the Jews." No, for all the people, all the nations, all the world. And then Simeon, when he's in the temple later on in Luke chapter 2, he meets this long-promised baby Messiah. And he's prays to God. He says, "My eyes have seen your salvation, that you have prepared in the presence of all peoples, a light for revelation to the Gentiles and for glory to your people Israel." So from the outset of Jesus' story, it's clear that the gift of the Messiah is intended for the blessing not just of the Jews, but of Gentiles as well. And shockingly, it's the Gentiles, these foreign astrologers, who are the most attentive and the most responsive to him when he actually comes. And their response to Jesus, their response to the light of the world is pure, unadulterated joy. And their joy comes to fruition in verse 11 in worship. It says, going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshiped him. Then opening their treasures, they probably carried treasure boxes, opened their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. The Magi, we read in verse 2, had traveled with the intention of worshiping or paying homage to this king. And when they find him in their joy, that's exactly what they do. And we see that their worship is genuine. And it includes humility. These grown men, these great wise men, fall down on their faces before this baby and worship him. And then they sacrifice. They present him with treasures, valuable treasures, expensive gifts that are worthy of royalty. And their worship is befitting the object of their worship. They recognize their place and they give their best to the one who's worth it. And they do it with joy. It's true worship. And then after finding and worshiping Jesus, the Magi are tipped off in a dream to Herod's schemes, and they sneak out of the country undetected. Verse 12 says, being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. And of course, Herod's response is that he's upset, he's troubled, he's furious, because he realizes that this baby, this upstart king, is dangerous. And so in the wake of the Magi secretly defecting out of Palestine, Herod responds with characteristic violence. If you look ahead to verse 16, it says that Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. You see, kings do not like it when their kingdoms are threatened. And Herod was just paranoid enough to see a baby as a threat. And maybe for good reason, because I think Herod knew his Bible. He knew what Isaiah said in Isaiah chapter 9. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government, the rule shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. On the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. So Herod comprehended who Jesus was, but comprehending who Jesus is not the same thing as joyfully welcoming him. You can say, yes, I believe in Jesus, but do you joyfully worship him? You can know exactly who he is and yet still reject him. And the threat that Jesus brought to Herod was that he would eventually dismantle every existing empire and overthrow every political power and subdue every opposing authority. So as crazy as he was, Herod was right to be troubled because he was up against a rival king whose kingdom was prophesied right here to last forever. The Prince of Peace will bring peace. But he won't bring peace by allowing everyone to do what they want. He won't bring you peace by allowing you to do what you want and get what you want. He will bring peace by upending your kingdom and my kingdom. You see, every single one of us spends a good deal of our lives, our money, our time, our energy, building up our own kingdoms. And even if we call ourselves Christians, what we often mean by that, without saying it, maybe not even consciously, but what we often mean by being a Christian is that we've committed ourselves to using Jesus to protect our kingdoms. It's kind of like we've hired him to run private security for us. And we demand that he guard our stuff, our self-rule, our self-reliance. We're not actually interested in Jesus actually ruling. But this baby, this infant, this Jesus has come to call us out, all of us. He's come to remind us that the Prince of Peace countenances no rivals. He will not give place to usurpers and challengers to his throne. And just like Jesus, we want to often silence the infant king. And we don't do it so brazenly as he did. We don't send soldiers to murder innocent children. What we do is that we relegate Jesus to a manger. We keep him bound up in swaddling cloths, and we keep him kind of a perpetual infant. We like the baby Jesus. Day after day, year after year, we prefer him in diapers, because if he's in diapers, he's not a threat. He doesn't demand anything from us. We don't have anything to lose. But remember what I said earlier. Jesus didn't stay a baby. He's not harmless. What Jesus did was he grew up to be a man. And that man came and he said hard things. He challenged authorities. And then he finally gave himself over to be arrested and tortured and murdered by those who saw him to be a threat to their kingdoms. So the Magi came to Jerusalem searching for the King of the Jews, and Jesus died outside of the walls of Jerusalem with a sign over his head that said, "The King of the Jews." And through his death, that man overcame every impediment between us and his kingdom. He got rid of all the stuff that holds us back from being his not only subjects, but his heirs, his children, his daughters and sons. And he didn't stay dead. And by not staying dead, he proved that royal power and prerogative are his, and that now, even now, he sits at the right hand of the throne of God with all power and all authority in the universe. And one day he will come back from there to judge and to conquer and subdue every and any kingdom that sets itself up against him, including yours, including mine. Jesus is the King. And because he's the King, your kingdom and my kingdom do not stand a chance. But here's the good news, is that his kingdom is so much better. The government shall be upon his shoulders. And of its increase, and of the increase of peace and hope and love and joy, there will be no end. And so the theme of this third week of Advent is joy. And I think joy is notoriously elusive. especially in difficult times like the one in which we find ourselves. And my suggestion this morning is that our experience of joy and our possession of joy have everything to do with how we respond to Jesus, which puts the onus on us. It puts the onus on us to respond. So will you, like Herod, see Jesus as a threat to your kingdom and take measures to protect yourself from his claims on you? Or will you, like the Magi, like these outsiders, will you welcome Jesus with joy and respond to him in worship? And as the worship team comes up, I would invite you to, even this morning, to come and lay down your arms. And with empty arms, open arms, to joyfully welcome and worship the newborn King. And I want to pray this prayer over you now. Come on up, worship team. Here's my prayer for you. Bow with me if you would. May your knowledge of Christ not outweigh your expectancy for Christ. May your protection of your own kingdom not outweigh your joy. And may your self-importance not outweigh your worship. Let's lay down our arms and open our arms to Jesus this morning and worship together. Amen.